Hello for the folks who are joining us now. Just to the right of this viewing window, you'll find the Q&A tab for your questions and the chat tab for you to connect with one another. All sessions are being recorded. This one is recording now. We'll be starting in just a few minutes.
Probably something similar, day of action. Yeah, I imagine it'll be a mix of this and probably like a Slack channel to have text-based discussions. And then Zoom will be the primary medium of the meetings with members of Congress and their staff. We'll be getting started here in just a minute or two for everyone joining in. This is a workshop, so your videos, it's a little bit of a different setup than some of the ones you've been watching. And I intend to put you all to work, so make sure to grab a pen and pencil, or a pencil and paper, or whatever your favorite medium of writing is. Brendan, do you have a branded coffee mug yet? I've got the Mascan Z official coffee mug.
I'm being paid by the good people at Snapple Corporation product today.
I guess it's got some caffeine. I've got my double shot latte here.
You forget, I'm 3 hours ahead of you. I was guzzling English breakfast tea all morning.
There you go. Jessica, should we wait a minute or should we start right on the dot?
Let's get started. Thank you to everyone who is joining us. Please use Whova to post your questions and chat with each other. And to launch our session today, please welcome Casey Dreyer.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming today to talk about Mars advocacy with us. So this is a workshop, and I was saying a workshop, we're going to take a slightly different approach than some of the more passive, just watching a presentation. And really what I'd like for you to have today is something just to write on, whether it's a piece of paper or a tablet or just your notepad on the computer, just something to write down some ideas, because I really want you to develop and kind of think about this idea of what it means to advocate for Mars and how you would approach this. Now, at the Planetary Society, we have a number of ways to educate you and empower you to become a better space advocate. We have Space Advocacy 101, which is at courses.planetary.org, which I really recommend that you try taking. It's free if you haven't done so already. And that really walks you through the nuts and bolts of how the US government works, how it funds space, and where the kind of basic ideas of reaching out to members of Congress come from and how to communicate effectively with them. Today's workshop is going to be taking a slightly different approach from that course. It's a complementary approach, and it's a bigger picture about Mars itself and how we try to get there and the differences in the ways in which we, kind of talk about types of Mars exploration. Joining me today is my colleague at the Planetary Society, Brendan Curry. He's our Chief of D.C. Operations. Some of you may already have met him before, but he's based in the D.C. area and has a long history with space, and also worked on the Hill himself as a congressional staff. So he's been on both sides of this equation. Brendan, you just want to say hello real quick?
Sure. Thanks, Casey. First of all, happy St. Valentine's Day to everyone. I appreciate everyone taking time to talk about this most romantic of topics, that is space policy.
Mars is red.
And how it emanates out of the most romantic place in the known universe, Washington, D.C. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, so I'm going to start sharing my screen here. And please, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A. I'm trying to keep an eye on those, and we'll try to address those within the course of this workshop. And just also to emphasize, Brendan and I, if you're a Planetary Society member, we work for you. So if we don't get to your question or you want to follow up on any ideas or thoughts, please follow up with us on Whova, or you can find our emails very, very easily on the Planetary Society website. And just don't hesitate to reach out for us. We're always here to help you. So I am going to start sharing my screen. And today, obviously, we're talking about advocating for Mars. So this is where I want you to use your writing implement. And I just want you to write down, just take 1 minute. It doesn't have to be a deep, long explanation. But if you were pressed by someone who came up and asked you, what is the best argument for the US to invest in Mars exploration? Why should we do this? What would you say? So just take 1 minute and write that down, or just write down a note so you remember what you say, just something to record what you think right now. And I will wait approximately 60 seconds. And if you don't feel strongly or don't really know how best to say it, that's totally fine, right? This is to establish kind of a baseline for this workshop. So now what we're going to do is we're going to break you out into a small group in order to meet some of your fellow Planetary Society members. It's going to be randomly assigned. You will be asked to join a breakout session. Feel free to turn on your cameras and use your microphones. Quickly introduce yourselves to each other, and you'll have about 7 to 10 minutes to exchange ideas and to say what you just wrote down, share that with each other, and kind of hear what other people are saying, see if you overlap with other people. And then we will come back as a full group and start talking about broader issues in Mars advocacy. So Jessica, if you could go ahead and break us up into sessions. Now is the time to do it. We will rejoin here in just a few minutes altogether. As people are coming back, why don't you go ahead and share in the chat window some of the ideas that either you resonated with or you yourself had, and give me a sense of what our starting place is in terms of how we're starting to think about advocating for Mars. So go ahead and put those in the chat window, and I'll just highlight a few to get started.
All right, all the breakout rooms are closed.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. Thanks for spending. I hope you had a nice time meeting briefly with your fellow members of the Planetary Society. If you could go ahead and pop some of your ideas and what you heard or what you resonated with in terms of why we should go to Mars, go ahead and put those into the chat window, and I'll highlight a few here as we move forward. So what did you like, or what did you feel is a good reason? Advancing our knowledge and finding a common goal to collaborate on globally. That's a great one. I like that one. To learn and challenge ourselves. Also a good one. The benefits of advancing our knowledge always, give us returns in the long run. Yep, jobs on Earth. Capture imagination of people. Sending humans to Mars will allow people to relate better to planetary exploration. That's a nice one. Future of humanity is in space. Steps to making life multiplanetary. That's like a good one, right? We don't want to be the one, all of our eggs in one basket kind of a planet. Great. Well, these are very good starting point for Mars advocacy. And the reason I asked you to write these down first is that I want to see how we can take these big ideas and start to refine them for a particular audience, right? The people who write the checks and write the policy that tells the United States where to go. And so this is where we'll start talking about here. And I think this is where we need to define what we mean by this, because we tend to talk about going to Mars with a certain implications that aren't necessarily always clear to everybody. And I think the difference in the subtleties here are actually really important. And we need to be aware of how we talk about going to Mars. And this may seem a little pedantic, but again, the politics and policy is nothing if not pedantic, right? And understanding your context and understanding why we're talking about certain things can really help be the outcome of success or failure, I think, in policy outcomes. And so what do we mean when we're talking about the policy of going to Mars? Well, I think we tend to mean human, but we should also be aware that we also have a robotic program, right? And how we talk about the policy and how we advocate for going to Mars is going to be different depending on which one we talk about. And why is that? Well, let's look at robotic. So robotic spaceflight, we're talking immediate or very near-term space policy, right? We have a robotic Mars program, right? We're about to land a Mars robot on the planet in 4 days from now. That means that there's an existing infrastructure around going to Mars. That means there's an established workforce of people who are invested in going to Mars. That means there's a dedicated science community that has been formed over the last multiple decades, dedicated to seeing these things happen. So this is a very type of, the process and framework exists for sending robotic things to Mars. You know, not just in the United States, but obviously other countries in the world, as we're seeing that we have the China and UAE are both sending missions this year. And the process of selection and prioritizing what types of robotic missions go to Mars at this point are the outcome of a scientific process through the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine called the Decadal Survey. We can talk about the Decadal Survey a little later if you'd like, but for those of you who are a little unfamiliar with it, it's basically a formal process of prioritization where all the scientific community in planetary sciences gets together, argues for about 18 months, and then releases this final report that is by law used to set the priorities of NASA's scientific programs. And so we have an established framework for setting Mars priorities. And so what does that mean in terms for us then, in terms of what we want and what we're advocating for, you know, for places like the Society, which is, again, a pro-science organization? Well, we have a pathway set out by the Decadal Survey to say Mars sample return is going to be the next immediate step after the Perseverance rover, right? So Perseverance rover is going to grab samples and prepare them, leave them on the surface here. And then you see this cute little European made fetch rover will come and grab those and send them back to Earth. That is all set up. The priorities are there, starting to work on this. And then our priorities, like we want to keep missions going and support the community's recommendations in this next Decadal Survey, which comes out in 22. So the advocacy work that we're going to be doing for robotic Mars exploration, we don't have to decide in a sense what the missions are going to be and how we do it. It's really, when it comes down to it, making sure the resources are there for NASA to successfully execute this plan, right? So it's a very straightforward type of advocacy that we're driving resources here. Now, this is very different when it comes to human exploration, right? Human exploration, we haven't done before, right? There's no extant human exploration to Mars program. This is a long-term goal. This is an aspirational policy goal. Much higher risk, much higher cost, all theoretical, right? There's no established Mars, humans to Mars workforce happening right now. There's no contracting base or groups that are invested in these programs continuing. And again, there's no historical context. And there's also no exact way to do it. We've been debating how best to send humans to Mars for 50 years now. And the consequences of that are that we don't have a kind of a stable framework by which to drive resources. We have to help build the coalition about how we're going to do that. That's a very different type of problem. And you know, honestly, a much harder problem to do because you're coalition building and trying to establish an enduring framework. So what we need, in a sense of what the society wants organizationally, is that we need a stable plan that'll carry us from the moon to Mars at this point, right? We need directed technology investment that'll start laying the groundwork for getting us there and reducing the cost and risk to make it happen. We need to make sure that our robotic missions are advancing the ability of humans to get there in the future. And we need to be helping to establish these international partnerships and commercial partnerships that'll help build this broader coalition of people who are invested in the outcome. Because politics works by coalition, right? If you don't have a large group of people invested in a singular outcome, it's much harder to maintain that goal over the years. And so our advocacy goal for human spaceflight is to build this enduring coalition. Like that's step one. And that's a harder lift because we don't have a pre-existing framework to come into. And again, I just want to give some context here. You know, when we're talking about different scales of policy program. My planetary exploration budget data set, which are all free to look at online, This is tracking all of NASA's robotic investments in Mars exploration in its entire history, right? And if you add that up and adjust for inflation, NASA's spent a little less than 2% of its entire expenditures in its 63-year history at this point on going to Mars, right? Very small amount, $28 billion. Well, you know, government speaking. And you can see huge spikes and swings in the investments in Mars over the years, right? We've actually been in this very stable period of Mars exploration, relatively speaking to the early parts of the 1970s and 1980s, which we effectively had none. Human spaceflight, very different situation. This is a projection from a recent report from the Science and Technology Policy Institute that estimated, you know, there's always a range of estimates for sending humans to Mars, but they said something like $184 billion on top of what NASA's already spending over the next 17 years if you want to land by 2037, right? Now, that lots of potential ways that this can change, but we're talking about an order of magnitude more expensive, right? NASA in its entire history has spent $28 billion on sending robotic missions to Mars ever. And here we would need an additional 200-ish billion dollars. What's a few billion dollars between friends here? $200 billion over the next 17 years. So that's an order of magnitude increase in commitment. And qualifiers, yes, SpaceX may offer some cheaper alternatives for at least for rockets. We can talk about that later. And there may be other technological breakthroughs that can help reduce this cost, but we're still looking at a significant increase. And that's what makes Mars and robotic spaceflight policy very different types of policy, ultimately. So again, some challenges that we all kind of know, but are worth elucidating about Mars, you know, when we're advocating for Mars, that we should be aware of so we can anticipate these arguments and try to build coalitions to address them, right? So as I was just kind of referencing, there's a technical or cost challenge of sending humans to Mars. Those are, I think, very closely intertwined. There's the political challenge, which kind of encompasses all this. How do you build this political enduring coalition, but also maintain it over time, right? How do you solve a political problem? What does Mars do for you? And then there's a fundamental base where politics in a representative democracy comes out of, right? Which is the public interest. Is there a public interest or support for this big endeavor? Or is it so weak that it won't help the political solution sustain itself? I'm just gonna give a few ideas to think about here, because I don't think anyone has the answer to this, right? If we had the answer, we'd be doing it. But here's some ideas for you to think about as you refine this idea that we started with about why do we go to Mars? Why should we invest in going to Mars? So how to make Mars, so technical and cost is investing. Can we find technology that reduces the cost and lowers the risk? And you do that by either with, again, this kind of concept, robotic, we've been spending about $500 million a year. Human, you need $10 billion a year. So that's really hard lift. So can you get something like what SpaceX is doing? Can you order of magnitude lower the cost of launch, right? So that can help you get a lot of stuff to Mars, but living on Mars, you need a lot more than rockets, right? You need everything. Human life support systems, you need your psychological and human health, you need to understand the concept, you need to have robotic ways to move around on the surface, to build, to, you know, just to live. You need a lot more work than just rockets, but rockets are a good part of it. This is also, I think, something really interesting. We just had a report come out last Friday or 2 days ago from the National Academies saying NASA should be investing more in in-space nuclear propulsion. Why? Because you can get to Mars faster with more powerful space propulsion. If you can get there faster, you simplify a lot of this program of getting humans to Mars because you don't have to keep humans alive in space as long, right? Space is constantly trying to kill you. If you can reduce the time you're in space, you can reduce the amount of backup supplies you have, backup hardware, contingency plans, radiation exposure. So much of getting to Mars becomes simpler if you can reduce the travel time. So can you be investing in technologies now and other ways of doing business now that feed into simplifying and making the trip and journey and requirements of sending humans to Mars more straightforward? So that's a potential solution to this technical and cost problem. The political problem, what does going to Mars solve? this is really important too, because we don't, even in, representative democracy, there's a lot of reasons we do things, but we tend to do things that solve some sort of broad problem, particularly if you get expensive, very expensive, and a lot of people invested in this. Apollo solved the problem, right? Project Apollo was a way for the United States to project technological superiority over a technologically adept and existentially threatening co-superpower on the global scale in front of a broad set of newly forming countries, right? It was very critical context that you had a bunch of new decolonized countries choosing their own political systems in the post-World War II era. So Project Apollo was a national security solution. It aligned with the needs of the national security concept of the United States. And once that was demonstrated, right, the political support kind of dissipated from Apollo. And there's a reason we're not going to the moon anymore at that scale. And so can Mars be a political solution? And this has, I think, been the most vexing problem, an enduring problem of human spaceflight, is that what political problem does it solve? And we can't always control this, right? It becomes it's reactive in a sense to global events. I think we have a good example of the International Space Station of being a model for this. And that may not mean that we exactly have the same conditions that we had this International Space Station, but it solved the problem of helping to create a post-Cold War global system of cooperation between two ex-superpowers, and also to keep a lot of Russian scientists and rocket engineers employed and not working for potentially adversarial countries to the United States. The cost of the International Space Station, anywhere from $150 to $200 billion, depending on how you account for it. So that's roughly what we're talking about for Mars missions, spread out over longer, but not nothing. And so there's a potential pathway for what problem can we solve for Mars, but we have to think about that. I think that's a big and ongoing issue. And then finally here, for the public, how do we make Mars relevant, that it becomes something that they support? This is really important here, then, that we should not shy away from this. We love space. I love space. I think Mars is really important. Not a lot of other people do. You look at this, this is a poll from the Pew Polling Organization from 2018 saying, what should NASA's top priorities be? And look at send astronauts to Mars in terms of what the public thinks, broad public thinks that should be a top priority, right? 18% more if it's saying an important but lower priority. And then look at the moon, right? Even lower than that. But what's NASA doing right now? We're going to the moon. So this doesn't necessarily preclude a potential mission, but it would certainly help if we had a broader set of public support. And so how do you make investments in space seem relevant to the public? Well, again, I think Apollo can tell us something about this, right? Investments in space are investments in the nation. And people, jobs, and economies can be very much tied up. This is where Apollo major contractors are based, right, all over the country. And this is where right now NASA is trying to make a similar pitch. This is from their recent economic report. And this is the monetary economic output by state of the current moon program of Artemis and other human spaceflight investments. And this is in the thousands, right? So Washington State up there on the left has $217 million of economic output. Not so much maybe in Alaska, but a lot obviously in Alabama and other places. So you can see there's a monetary and practical consequence of investing in space, right? It's what we've been saying for a long time now. Space is not something done out there. Space is something we do here, right? It's an investment in our people and our workforce and our high-skilled needs of the nation. There's more data in this, obviously, but like look at the number of jobs that are supported by what NASA is doing now. So if you increase this by $10 billion a year for a Mars program, you get a commensurate increase in jobs supported by this. We tend to talk about pejoratively missions or projects as merely jobs programs, but jobs are what helps drive the politics of so many things. And we should think about how we can make a good practical case for creating jobs that don't just do nothing, but that do something, right? Any organization or any advocacy group worth its salt, they open with how many jobs they're creating in that congressional person's district. That is the opening argument you make. We should not shy away from this. All right, so how do we start making the case more effectively? So I want to turn this over very quickly. Well, first, let me just make one point here, and I'll turn this over to my colleague, Brendan. space is still, even if we get a $10 billion increase to NASA focused on Mars, it's still going to be one of the smaller expenditures of the federal government, right? Federal government's a $4.5 trillion a year expenditure machine, and we're talking about maybe $30 to $40 billion for NASA at the best case scenario, very tiny fraction, right? So we don't need to convince every member of Congress. We just need to convince the right members of Congress, and using key people in the public, basically you, advocates, space advocates, who can go and make that case to your elected officials to say that NASA and going to Mars is not something that's abstract or weird, but something that you care about as a constituent that benefits your district or your state directly, right? It's not a kind of a high-minded ideal, which it is exclusively, but it's something that returns real practical benefits for the people in your area. And so when we talk about the congressional mind, when we're reaching out to members of Congress and their staff, we have to remember that they have to think about a lot of things, right? The next election is always on the forefront of their mind. There are big issues like healthcare, right now, the COVID epidemic, what they're going to do on the weekend to blow off steam. You're competing for mind space. You're competing for a beachhead in their brain that space is an issue to even care about, not much less even something like Mars. And so you have to be active and engaged on a regular pace, whether it's with us at the Planetary Society or individually throughout the year, to help remind them that these issues exist, right? Representative democracies work if you show up and you're then represented. If you don't do this, you cannot assume that your member of Congress is going to follow an issue just because they find it interesting. They have to be hearing from their constituents that it's important to them. So we have actual data that supports this, right? This is not just me and Brendan saying this. This is from a survey of congressional staff, basically saying, what's the most effective way, if your boss, your member of Congress is undecided on an issue, what's the most effective way that your boss will make a decision for constituents to change that decision or to influence that decision? As that in-person visits from constituents, the best way, right? And then individual letters, phone calls, right? Form faxes, I guess, don't bother doing those. So it's basically, relates very closely to the amount of time you spend. The more time you spend, the more they realize that there's probably a lot of people like you who don't have that time, but also care about the issue. So this is something that is valuable to do, to show up. And this is what we tend to say, why we go to Congress every spring to advocate directly. Obviously, we can't do that this year for very good reasons, but why we will be doing this again. So Brendan, this is where I want to turn it over to you to address some of these ideas about when you reach out to somebody in Congress and when you reach out to a congressional staff. Who are you talking to? Because this is something like know your audience, but also what are you looking for as a staff member to help to be an effective communicator? How can our members of the Planetary Society and space advocates be good at this? And what tips and tricks can you share with them? Brendan, you're muted. Now you're muted. Try one more time.
Someone
there
muted.
You are. You're good.
Anyways, a lot of good friends I'm seeing on the call today. Thanks for everyone for beaming in. Real quick, over the course of this Planet Fest, I was reached out to by a number of the Planetary Society members who were really sending me some kind words and some wonderful sentiments about how things are in Washington. Obviously, things have not been normal for at least a year now. The Capitol's been closed. There was essentially a quarter of the year, the entire Congress was shut down. And Casey's point about how do we interact with staffers, for those of you who were at Day of Action last year, I gave one type of talk. This year, I'm going to give a little bit of a different type of talk. You can put a price tag on the constituent outreach to a member and their staff. That goes without saying. It really does go a long way. And Day of Action last year helped in that way, but it's very good that we're still doing Day of Action virtually this year. But the congressional staffers, they deal with a lot of things in, day out, in case you had that image of the brain and things like that. But one of the things that we've been seeing throughout this past year is that congressional staffers are dealing with things in a way that aren't normal. A senator or a congressperson has their district office or their home state team, and they deal with issues like, a constituent social security check is arriving late, things like that. That's called constituent caseload. And then the people in the Washington office deal with policy, legislation. The congressman or senator's press secretary is up on the Washington team. The chief of staff is up on the Washington team. But last year, and we're still seeing it this year, you're seeing a lot of the DC team being repurposed to augment the constituent casework that is being done at the state level. A couple of examples last year, Senator Shelby from Alabama, one of his staffers I dealt with on space issues, she got repurposed because, don't forget, the virus hit during the March timeframe. She was totally taken off handling space issues for Senator Shelby because she was tasked with repurposing over 200,000 Alabamans who were stranded overseas, and a lot of them were college spring breakers. So she was dealing with a whole bunch of stuff like that. Utah, a lot of SRB work goes out in Utah. The space staffer in Senator Lee's office was charged with trying to repatriate Mormon missionaries back to the United States who were stranded overseas. Right now, a lot of congressional staffers are being repurposed to augment the casework that's being done at the home state level with respect to vaccine distribution and working with whomever the governor's teams are. So keep in mind that there's other things at play here when you're interfacing with these folks. And a lot of what I've been doing throughout the year is just checking in with folks, because some of you have heard me say this before. I was a staffer on the Hill during 9/11, and then we had anthrax sent to our offices. And so I saw three different types of people engaging with us. And we had the people that were checking in, but they weren't really providing any helpful information. And then you had the second type of people who are acting like all this stuff that was going on wasn't going on. And they were concerned about with whatever their parochial interest was. And they were seemingly oblivious to the larger set of things going on, consuming everyone else's time. And then there were the third types of people who were just checking in to see how I was doing, see how my spouse was doing, and trying to just share helpful information and information that I could help them with. And just remember, these are people, these are real people. And so when you're engaging with them, keep that in mind. And so this year so far, it's going to be still very difficult. Congress is still locked down. The events of January 6th have not helped. And so even the big space company lobbyists are stymied with how they're trying to figure out how to engage with the congressional staff. Last year was a lot easier in many ways because there wasn't a lot of staff turnover. It was an election year. So we had already enjoyed a real good level of relationships with the existing staffers because no one wanted to go anywhere until after the elections. Well, now we have the elections take place. We have new government taking shape. We have new Congress taking place. We have new people in staff positions all across the government coming in. And it's very difficult to meet these new people. And so just try to keep a soft touch, be patient, but be enthusiastic. And I keep stressing this, space still by and large enjoys a tremendous amount of bipartisan support. I know a lot of what's showcased on social media and cable news gives the impression that everyone in Washington hates each other all the time about all issues. Space is one of those wonderful areas where there's a lot of goodwill between a lot of the actors that Casey referenced that we need to reach out and touch. And the Planetary Society does enjoy a a lot of goodwill, because we can be the honest broker of good information. And we're also, and I'm trying not to be sarcastic when I say this, we're kind of a warm and fuzzy being a nonprofit. You know, we don't get money from NASA. We don't get money from the Pentagon. We're not bankrolled by SpaceX or Lockheed Martin. We're bankrolled by individual members, the people like you that Casey and I work for. And I'll leave it at that and look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Brendan. I think the key there is that you have to remember that your person you're talking to is a human who are dealing with a lot of other issues besides space. And so being persistent, but also being compassionate and empathetic is going to go a long way. But also, we were just talking about this, Brendan, like we're at the first inning of a 9-inning ball game in terms of getting humans to Mars, right? That is a big challenge. And to me, one of the most effective things in terms of how we see policy outcomes in space develop and reach, kind of once you reach this certain tipping point, they become very enduring, right? It's very possible for particularly big human spaceflight programs to last a long time if we get to that turning point. Great example, the space shuttle, approved by Nixon in 72. Last flight was in 2011, right? That's almost a 40-year program. International Space Station started as Space Station Freedom in Reagan's State of the Union address, 1984, continuing at least until the end of the 2020s, right? So that's almost a 40-year program as well. And so can Mars, if we're seeing this with building up the moon, can we use the coalition and infrastructure building up the moon to then generate this next step out to Mars? And once you get enough people bought into that, it can be very, very powerful. And I think this is this gradual build out and having that kind of patience and understanding that Mars is a very difficult thing. And again, I keep adding this qualifier. There's type of technology that may fundamentally change this equation, but we need to see that technology proven first before we really are able to move beyond that. So there's, in the last 20 minutes here, we will take some questions. I'm just checking the chat here, but I wanted to switch back and talk about our opening point here. So let me share my screen again, if I can find out how to do that. Here we are. We'll disappear for a second. But again, this is this key idea of coalitions. And this is something for you to think about too, as a Mars advocate, about what types of coalitions can we help build and that'll sustain this effort to go to Mars? And I would toss out a couple of potential options here, really practical things, right? Aerospace suppliers, people who have a business interest in seeing this happen. This can be companies like SpaceX. This can be companies like up here in Washington State, Tethers Unlimited, which builds small experimental spacecraft and supplies into large efforts by Boeing and others. That's how you build this job argument that hits every state of the union. You have the scientific community. Obviously, they'd love to see the science returned from something like going to Mars, right, with humans, because the infrastructure you will have to bring back a lot of stuff. You'll be able to explore a lot of different areas of the planet that you can't easily with robots. There's the impacts of being at NASA centers, right, of having their investment and their advocacy to their local representatives. Unions who have to benefit from high-skilled, high-paying jobs that come from the aerospace sector. Entrepreneurs in commercial space sector who want to have access to this government money to help build their companies. There's a lot of potential opportunities here that Mars can help fill. And I think we're seeing this starting to be used at the moon that I think, and from the International Space Station, that are very good frameworks to build on when we're talking about humans to Mars. So for your last lesson or task for this workshop, I would like you to briefly revisit your original argument that you made at the beginning here for why we should invest in Mars. What is the best argument? Has this changed based on talking to your fellow colleagues at the Planetary Society? Has this changed from hearing from anything that Brendan or I said? If not, why not? Maybe think about that. And if it has, how would you reformulate that argument? How would you take your initial idea and craft it to be inspired or influenced by some of the key points we were making today, talking about the context of getting humans to Mars, talking about the political challenges, talking about the public challenges? And once you do that, you don't have to do that right now. It may take a little bit of thought, but I really want you to take some time after this workshop and just think about this argument and how it's going to be received by other people who may not already be bought into this idea. And how do you make this a solution to a problem in politics? And you don't have to figure out the perfect answer, right? It's a hard problem. But once you've refined your answer, this is what I leave you to, this is my challenge that I leave you with at the end of this workshop before we start taking some of your questions. I want you to take that argument and I want you to communicate that to your elected officials. I want you to go to their websites and find their contact information. And I want you to write that out. It can be a short email, it can be a longer email, but just a thoughtful, caring, empathetic email that makes this case for this long-term effort. And I want you to take that step. Brendan.
Yeah, and keep in mind that these emails will be sent to staffers to read. So keep that in mind. And you know, Casey and I are always at your beck and call if you want to check with us on stuff. We're here for you. Reach out to us anytime you want throughout the year.
Yes, absolutely. So we can help you respond to that if you're unsure about your argument. But I want you just to get in the practice of communicating. And, you know, we offer at the Planetary Society, we offer ways that you can easily send a message to Congress that automatically sends to your members. But for this one, I want you, again, to take that step of just write or call or however you feel comfortable, write this out and put some thought into it and see what the response is like. And again, you may get a positive response, you may get a tepid response, you may get no response at all, but just ask for a response. Brendan.
And throughout the year, there'll be wonderful opportunities to do this. We're not saying you have to nag them every week, but you know, fingers and toes crossed, perseverance lands. What a great opportunity.
Exactly.
To reach out, capitalizing on a great moment, something hopeful, optimistic, forward-looking, American leadership at play. What a time to beam in with your member of Congress. There'll be attempts to do NASA authorization bills that are going to have to go through certain milestones throughout the legislative process. Remember, we're in a 9-inning ball game. Same thing with appropriations. Throughout the year, Casey and I will be working on transmitting information to you all about where the policy process is going for space. And those key points throughout the year are going to be wonderful opportunities for you to build up relationships and engage. So it doesn't seem like you're coming out of the ether just harem scarum, but it's going to be timely in your messaging and how you deliver it.
Yeah. After a successful landing on Mars is a great time to reach out about Mars, whether it's human or robotic. So again, this could also be just supporting the robotic program. The other action I'm going to challenge you all to do, if you haven't already, is to take Space Advocacy 101, our free online course designed to be done at your own pace. Usually takes a couple of hours all together. That's at courses.planetary.org. And we go through a lot of the nuts and bolts. If you want to get more specific tips on communicating to members of Congress, if you want to understand more details about how the budget process works, this is where you're going to learn about that. And then, of course, if you like this topic, we are doing a day of action this year on March 31st. It will be a virtual day of action, something like this, where you will be able to talk with members of Congress and their staff via Zoom. We will have a training session for that and other kind of bonus community building things that we can do online. And you can sign up for that at planetary.org/day of action. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And we have a few minutes that I'd like to address some of the questions that we've had coming in. And so I can see a few of them, and I'll see what I can do best ones here. And you can put them in the chat or in the Q&A portion. I'm trying to look at both. But again, think of this as a long-term goal for humans to Mars. And it's not something that we can just decide or convince someone to do brute force, but we're going to be building a group of people who are going to be invested in this as an outcome that benefits us. And there's no shame, I think, in thinking about the politics of space, of saying, are there practical benefits? Even if people, the ultimate goal, I think, in space policy or space politics or space advocacy is to get people who couldn't give less of a care about space to support it because they have a practical reason to do so. That's how you build an enduring program. Ultimately, of course, I want them all to love space and think it's the greatest thing ever, but we need people who don't feel that way to still support it. And that's the idea of building this coalition. And you can even do that just by getting your friends and family to be interested in space as well. And the easiest way to start advocating for space is to get your friends and family just interested in the idea. All right, so let's take some of your questions. Brendan, I have one here asking about the status of the Planetary Science Caucus. So maybe say what that is first, and then let us know what the current status and why we have to do this every 2 years.
Sure. Now you hear the term congressional committees a lot, and those are the organizations that actually formulate and write legislation that eventually, hopefully, gets passed into law, signed into law, I should say. Caucuses are more informal organizations of like-minded members of Congress. There's a duck hunting caucus. There is a fishing caucus. There is a air power caucus. There's a number of caucuses that like-minded members can join on to and work together on. Some of them are more politically supercharged than others. Some of them deal with Second Amendment issues, for example, things of that nature. But space being one that is a pretty bipartisan effort, is that last year we had the Planetary Science Caucus, and we had Congressman Derek Kilmer, Democrat, and Congressman Stephen Palazzo from Mississippi co-chair it. And we had several dozen, both House and Senate Republicans and Democrats, be members. And it was an opportunity in the last Congress for us to bring thought leaders, decision makers up into the Hill, and we would put on breakfast briefings in the morning. You didn't have the fear and loathing of a congressional hearing. It was a nice back and forth between very smart people who work in the space business to interact with members of Congress and their staff. And of course, last year in the second half of the congressional session, that all kind of fell away due to the virus. Now with the onset of the new 117th Congress, we have to recapitalize and formalize the caucus again. Mr. Kilmer, I'm happy to report, is enthusiastically wanting to take the leadership role in the caucus, and we're working on getting it back together. We have a Republican by the name of Anthony Gonzalez from Ohio that wants to get involved. And one of the things that helps inform who we ask to think about joining the caucus is we look at who populates the various committees on the Hill that deal with space. And so they have a part of their job is to work on space policy. So ergo, why don't you think about getting involved, and your staff getting involved in a group that cares about space? A lot of these members get their committee assignments because they have a personal interest. Some of it's a constituent interest. Like Casey said, they have a NASA senator in the district, or they have a NASA contractor in their district, or a big university in their state or district is a beneficiary of NASA funding. But some of them are just stone cold space nerds, and they think it's cool, and that's great. That's fun. There's nothing wrong with that. And so we're going through the process of identifying new members. We just on Friday had the House Space Committee get put together. I was happy to report to Bill Nye that his Congressman Brad Sherman is on the space subcommittee, and Mr. Sherman's been a strong leader on space and a member of the caucus last time. So I'll be annoying his space staffer pretty soon about getting Mr. Sherman back on. So it's a wonderful opportunity. And so when you're engaging with your members of Congress, especially after a hopefully successful landing later this week, maybe put the bug in their ear saying, I would like Congressman or Senator to give some consideration to joining the Congressional Space Caucus. Later this week, I'll be talking with Senator Marco Rubio's office. Obviously, Florida is a very important state. A lot of space activity. Most of the missions we care about fly out of that state. And 2022 isn't too far off for Mr. Rubio either.
Yeah, it's practically around the corner, politically speaking. Another question we have here, there's someone from Canada saying, what can he do? Sorry, or she, I didn't read the name closely enough. What can they do to best convince people in the political system in Canada to invest in space? The Canadian Space Agency is, I'd say, orders of magnitude smaller than NASA, but obviously they partner a lot with other nations, in particular NASA. So Brendan, what would you say to that? From what's a good case that you've heard?
Well, first of all, write your member of parliament or engage a member of parliament. I think we have someone from Alberta on our video today, or was signed up at least, and they can get just as involved in their systems of government as we suggest that Americans can. And one of the other things I wanted to mention is that all spacefaring nations have someone at their embassy, or even their space agency has a standalone office here in Washington. And one of the most interesting and fulfilling parts of my job as representing the Planetary Society is engaging these space attaches. And they're wonderful people, and they're more technically inclined people. They're not political animals. And that's good. And the funnier part of my job is trying to explain to them how the heck we run our government here. So in the light of the election, it's been exceptionally interesting, but they love the idea of working with us. The Japanese have been expressly interested in working with us more. We've connected them recently to have some officials from JAXA do a planetary radio episode with Matt. And so I wholeheartedly endorse you reaching out to your members of government, your representatives in your government. Maybe your nation does not have a large space agency. If you're European, there's probably some part of what your nation does help support the European Space Agency or the European Union space efforts. So there's many opportunities for you guys to get involved. The more the merrier, and in the words of John McClane, welcome to the party, pal.
Yeah, I would say, just to add on to that, Brendan, that we do have a colleague of ours, Kate Howells, who is involved in space policy and in Canada. She's Canadian. You can always reach out to her directly. She's very easy to find on our website, and she'll have more specific ideas for you in the Canadian political system. And just more broadly, I remember being in a conference, a space policy conference in Canada, and one of the big benefits of space for nations like Canada is that it provides this opportunity to leverage their international partnerships with their allies. And a peaceful cooperative effort to develop technology, you get all the good benefits of space, right? Technology, inspiration, STEM workforce, but you're also leveraging your partnerships with your allies, and it provides you an opportunity to strengthen those. And you see this with Canada coming on to providing the Canadarm3 on the Gateway space station at the moon, and many other opportunities in terms of planetary missions. There's been the APXS instrument on a lot of Mars rovers that have been developed in Canada, and building and leveraging Canada's technological community and its international ties. And I think that's always, for nations of that size and scope, that's a really attractive area. And this is kind of what Artemis has been trying to build on, and I think we can use that for Mars. So we have 2 minutes, so very quickly, I want to address one more question here that I saw, which was about, can we talk about the problem of uneven funding and how that impacts space programs? And this is a fundamental problem of the system that we have, particularly in the United States, right? That Congress appropriates on a 1-year cycle, often very late, past their deadline, and space programs take years, if not decades, to pull off. And there's no easy solution to this, because members of Congress and, honestly, people in the White House, they like to have, they're representing their constituents. They want to have control over budgets. That's how you control policy. And to give like a 5-year budget to NASA would be to ask them to relinquish their control to a previous Congress, to people in the past. And a lot of politicians are loath to do that. And so it's almost by design in our system is to be a little inefficient. And I've talked about this before, that there may be just a fundamental trade-off for pursuing big complex projects in a representative democracy. To have oversight and to have control from a political system is to invite inefficiencies as by design, but that also gives you political oversight and control. To have more efficiencies, you would need to have less oversight, less control from representatives, and to give more, in a sense, a dictatorial control over funding and policy that is not responsive to changes in politics. Now, there's probably some sort of balance to find there, but I think in the system we have, it's kind of designed to be inefficient. That's a feature, not a bug, right? And you look at companies like SpaceX, well, they can be efficient and fast because they have a benevolent dictator basically running. It's a company, right? A privately held company where one person can make the decisions and they can happen very fast. But there's no public oversight to that. So what's the right balance if we're spending taxpayer funds? And that's something, I'll just leave you with that as we're at our last minute, that it's a fundamental challenge in our representative system. And we're trying to find that and support what we can. So I want to thank you all so much for coming to our workshop today. If you have questions further for me and Brendan, don't hesitate to reach out. We will do our best to answer some of the lingering questions in the Q&A on Whova after this session. So look for any responses from Brendan or I. He's already been in there answering some of your questions. And as you develop your argument to send to your elected official, if you have any questions or uncertain about it, feel free to reach out to us and we'll give you our opinion. Or if you hear back, let us know what you hear. So thank you so much for coming. And thank you again so much for supporting the Planetary Society and celebrating Mars with us this weekend. And we'll wish for the very best for the Perseverance rover on the 18th.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Casey and Brendan, for sharing your expertise with us today. Friends, during your short break, stop into our exhibitor section. We have some tremendous supporters who help make Planet Fest possible. You can click on exhibitors on the far left in Whova to see those profiles. Coming up next is a unique opportunity to learn more from some folks whose passion for space has fueled some really creative endeavors. Please click on agenda to the far left and choose the session title that most interests you to get connected. Thank you.
Thank you.
And come to the human spaceflight talk that I'm doing later today with Rick Davis from NASA. You want to hear more about human spaceflight on Mars.